Okay, the great dream debate. Freud in depth. This is my makeup video. First of all, thank you for allowing me to do this, and let's get into it. So, before Freud, before Freud, there were essentially, I guess, just to really simplify it, there were two main types of dream interpretation. There's an ancient variety and more of a scientific sort of variety, more like 19th century scientific variety. For the ancient variety, there was quite frequently divination and prophecy. So, dreams were said to be foretelling of the future, and they were quite important in some ways, in an esoteric kind of way. A lot of these were quite esoteric. Symbolic interpretation as well. I referred to more of like an understanding the dream more of as like a whole, where you can substitute the content within a dream directly into a coherent narrative, right? So the dreams made more sense in these symbolic ways. And then there's also kind of thinking about it where it was a cipher, right? Or a dictionary type of thing where you can look up bits and pieces. The dream is like a fragmented code that can be deciphered by looking up the right ciphers or symbols. And these each have meanings, specific meanings attributed to them that a dream dictionary can provide answers to, right? Freud's biggest kind of mm, criticism of this is that it ignores specific context, right? It does not really include the individual. It's ahistorical of that. It's acontextual. It doesn't matter. There's like a symbol and it means the same for everyone, which Freud didn't believe that was the case. The other one was the scientific one, where for a lot of Freud's contemporaries believed that dreams, symbolism, and dreams essentially just were meaningless. It was just fluff. It was just reaction to psychological or physical stimuli in the environment, and they didn't really reflect anything. They're quite largely meaningless. They were potentially externally influenced, like yeah, it's like things from the outside of the person were influencing them, and they're also largely superficial, right? There were some thinkers, obviously, that maybe thought it was connected to specific memories or thoughts related to everyday life, what was called the continuity hypothesis. Some other thinkers also thought potentially that maybe it was a little bit more nuanced and could be related to unconscious mental processes. So Freud wasn't the only one in this sense. He wasn't the only one thinking out loud about this, but Freud did innovate. For him, he developed something. He started at this when he was 41. He underwent a lot of self-analysis, started working on his own dreams, and ended up writing a book on dreams when he was 41. So quite early in his career, and he continued to work on dream concepts and expand on them for much of his life. So initially, it was all about wish fulfillment, and eventually became more about a compromise. But we'll get to that a little bit later. But overall, he termed dreams as the royal road to the unconscious activities of the mind, right? This challenged the status quo directly, essentially, that dreams were not just a simple byproduct, right? Rather, they were the product. They provided direct access to the unconscious, the royal road to the unconscious. It was a direct representation of the processes of the unconscious, things that he was very interested in. So therefore, dreams were psychologically meaningful, and they expressed unconscious wishes, desires, conflicts, a lot of things, and they were not direct. They were distortions. They were distortions that were meant to protect the mind and the processes of sleep. But we can talk about that a little more later. But before we do, we got to talk about Freud's model of the brain. This informs his dream theory, so we need to spend a little bit of time here. We all know about the id, the ego, and the superego in some sense. Id is the more primitive side, more about immediate gratification. It can be something construed as something that's demanding, and it could be impulsive. Superego is our sense of morality, our conscious society rules and practical expectations that have been internalized. It's a lot of guilt and shame and punishment that's associated with the superego. And there's the ego that's mediating the two, right? It's the in-between. It's in charge of trying to satisfy the id's urges in an appropriate way, whereas while also maintaining the superego's morality. So it tries to toe the line between the two. And the idea is that the material from the id in dream theory might be a bit too much, right? So the yeah, so like there's certain things that happen when the mind represses certain wishes and urges that it might be just too much that happen in waking life. So it gets filtered down from the unconscious, from the conscious to the preconscious to the unconscious. Um, but overall, I think what's kind of interesting too is that the translation of id, ego, and superego had an issue. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I was shocked by this. Is that Freud conceptualized the id, the ego, and the superego as the it, the I, and the over I. So the it, which is the id, was meant to be a simpler pronoun, similar to like child, kinder. It was neutral. It's asexual. It was also meant to evoke a sense of earlier, preconscious state of existence before eventually developing into a defined sense of self, a defined sense of I, right? So it's kind of interesting. So like in this way, id or the it isn't just a drive, it's also a reservoir of emotion and complex energy, psychic energy, part of the libido, the thanatos, those kind of things. And it is quite fascinating, right? Anyway, um, and then in this way, the dreams are a compromise, right, between navigating the energy and this preconscious state of existence from the id and the more socially refined and prim and proper forces of the superego. So it's kind of interesting in that sense. Okay, dreams. For Freud, sleep actually was best when it was dreamless. That's the way that you had your best sleep. For him, overall, dreams were the residue, the outcome of a reflexive safety process that guarded the quality of sleep. Essentially, dreams guard sleep from interruption. What would we be interrupted from? Well, we'd be interrupted by the infantile urges and drives of the id, or pressures of waking life, lots of things, emotions, drives, wishes, experiences that sometimes the mind cannot fully handle and are repressed. So Freud initially, as I mentioned, suggested that the primary purpose of dreams was wish fulfillment from the unconscious and infantile states. And then he eventually went to go on and say that, you know what, at this point, sorry, when he first developed wish fulfillment, he actually hadn't actually fully conceptualized the id, the ego, and the superego, the structural model. So later on, he refined this wish fulfillment model of just handling and like working with these unconscious infantile states and developed them into a compromise formulation where the id gets some wishes granted and the superego gets some of its wishes granted, and the ego expresses the guilt, the self-control, the happiness, what have you, in the way by way of dreaming and dream work. With the primary outcome is that loaded psychic material is often repressed. Not always, not a perfect system, but the idea is to repress the material, transform it into a way that's less intrusive so that the person can sleep. That is the prime idea. It is, yeah. And I guess if I'm looking at my slides properly, it does say that night equals reduced repression. During the day, we do have our processes of repression operating quite well, but at nighttime when we sleep, we have reduced repression. And this is when these things can come in. And when they're unchecked, they would wake people up from their sleep, and therefore they have to be repressed. And they go through the censorship of the ego. Yeah. So then this dream work, this subterfuge, works by a variety of key ways. One of the most common ones and popular ones is displacement. So displacement is the changing of one thing into another. Through this process, emotional intensity of the repressed material that is trying to bubble up is shifted into or onto safer targets for expression. It's less threatening. It's more distance. It gives you this range, an arm's length. So, for instance, rage at a parent, someone that you love, a guardian, might appear as an annoyance at a stranger. Then there's also condensation. The condensation is very interesting. It is the collapse of several different concepts into one. It's an amalgamation, a composite image of different people, memories, concepts, desires, wishes, and it amalgamates them into a single figure, an image, or anything that can occupy some sort of representation within a dream. And then there's also representation, right? Which is transforming thoughts into visual images, right? Abstract thoughts. Thoughts are very abstract. It's just literally a string of words and letters in your, not even letters, it's just, yeah, thoughts are extremely abstract. Feelings can be very abstract. And then dream work transforms this into visual images, sensory images, sometimes smell images, if you can even picture that. Some people can smell in dreams. So it's like very, very visceral. It can be experienced through the senses, right? And this has often been quite symbolic, and which prompted the development of dream lexicons and such. But overall, dream work's job, if done correctly, is censoring, editing, and compromising, right? Now, an interesting kind of aside is that for Freud, no psychological growth occurs while dreaming. For Freud, dreaming itself doesn't change you. It, it's the reflection. It's a reflection or an expression of what's already there. It's the interpretation, the gaining of insight, and learning from it. That's how growth comes about. So therefore, dreams are overall a natural byproduct of maintaining sleep. All right, wish fulfillment. Freud wanted people to keep an eye out on day residues in general. Um, Let me start this in a better way. So overall, wish fulfillment was the original goal of his book that he wrote, Dream Interpretation, in 1941. And then, as I mentioned, it kind of shifted into compromise. But typically, people tend to just kind of stick with wish fulfillment. It makes the most sense, right? So dreams are unconscious representations of these wishes or compromises that have filtered through. Um, and one of these things that gets seen within dreams, or when dreams actually do come about and that can be memorized or remembered rather, is the day residue dreams. So these are images that just happen during the day, relatively recently in the last couple of days or weeks. They often provide the material or the scaffolding for a dream, and they set the stage for the unconscious expression of wish fulfillment, right? But by sheer virtue of its recency. Then there's convenience dreams, and these are relatively simple. Some people consider them bodily wishes, right? So you're thirsty, you dream of water. Your alarm goes off, you dream of church bells. You're horny, you dream of you fill in the blank. So in a sense, these dreams fulfill the wishes of the id by handling whatever outside stimulus or whatever stimulus, and then weave it into the dream. Now there's complex dreams, which include the day residues, but they also may be tied to what Freud referred to as infantile desires, right? So this desire for being loved exclusively by someone or having unlimited gratification and so on and so forth, right? So these dreams are from an earlier phase of psychological development where the pleasure principle was in full control. With Freud, there's two main principles that drove some of his thinking. It's the pleasure principle and the reality principle. The pleasure principle is kind of what happens when you're an infant, a child, with the id kind of more or less dictating behavior from those processes. And then eventually the ego comes online by way of influence from the superego, which internalizes a lot of moral rules, parental rules, and so on and so forth. And therefore the reality principle comes into play, where the ego maintains a grip on reality by holding back the id in some sense. There's also many dreams many dreams fulfill wishes we would disown. So rivalry, jealousy, rage, sexual curiosity, so on. And this disowning, this is the difficult nature of the repressed subject matter, is why Freud believes dream work took place in the first place, because these things can keep us awake. They would bother us. We push them down for a reason, and we suppress them for a reason when we're awake, and then we need to keep them away from our dreaming life or a dreaming mind so that we can continue sleeping. Um, for Freud, also, not all dreams look like they can be easily explained as wish fulfillment. This, like the anxious dreams, nightmares, punishment dreams, these all fit in. It's a range of different signals that just represent internal struggle to a certain extent. But overall, it can be explained as different impulses potentially, or the superego coming online and saying that you deserve to be punished. For instance, I deserve to suffer is a dream wish that is granted by the unconscious for so that you can relive and experience punishment to relieve guilt, right? So it's not all about the id. Traumatic dreams, these can be interesting. It's more complex dream theory, but essentially trauma survivors of trauma can have frequent recurrent nightmares. Freud tackled this problem by weaving in the death drive and trying to say that these repetitive, unpleasurable dreams can reveal something beyond the pleasure principle and, signify a drive to repeat and return to an earlier period of time where there was less tension, but also you can also go back and repeat these things in a way to gain control and reducing anxiety through exposure. It's a little bit complex, but yeah, no one's saying this is true, but who knows? And speaking of which, in this picture here it says dreams are an act of wish fulfillment by the unconscious mind. What a fascinating hypothesis. How do you tend to test it? Blank stare. You are going to test it, right? Well, it's very, very difficult to test what he's saying. That's why psychoanalysis has had such a kick in the teeth for the last, 60 to 70 years, in large part due to the APA's, let's say, insistence on more of a Kraplerian kind of conceptualization of psychology, where you just like things that can be checklists and scientifically proven, which is good. That's how science advances. But yeah. Anyway, that's besides the point. Anyway, content interpretation for dreams. Two types of content really. There's manifest content, so that's the content that is just on the surface. It's what it looks like, and then there's latent content, the content that is the outcome of the dream work. So it's what the dream work is based on, right? The latent content is the source material, and the manifest content is the outcome of the dream work. So for Freud, interpretation is guided through recognizing that there's manifest content and latent content, and then you would translate and essentially reverse the dream work from manifest to latent, right? And this is done by self-observation and free association, right? You want to create a heightened sense of awareness. You want to suspend your judgment. You don't want to censor or judge your thoughts. You want to be spontaneous and relay every idea to the therapist, no matter how random. You really want to silence this inner critic because this is how the unconscious can come forward. It allows the id to emerge. So this is a way how you would replace the dream work of displacement, condensation, and representation. And throughout the course of free association, it would be important to be aware of day residues. And this is how you would do the interpretation. I want to touch on a little bit on Jung, just so that these are somewhat contemporary individuals. And Jung was a powerhouse in this. For him, dreams were more spontaneous products of the unconscious, and they serve more of a compensatory function, right, rather than a compromising function, as Freud would say, right? So opposed to wish fulfillment, for Jung, it was more of like a self-regulatory and self-corrective thing. So I guess, you could even say it, I would think you could call it self-fulfillment instead of wish fulfillment, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, for him, dreams were a transparent and creative process. They offered a view into the natural expression of the psyche's current state. They were there to balance out attitudes and emotions. And for him, it was important to distinguish between the objective and the subjective. For him, objective was relating to the dreamer's external reality, and in terms of the subjective dream interpretation, it was relating to the dream elements about the dreamer himself. He liked to divide these two up. And Jung believed that the dream image does have both of these, but he put a greater emphasis on the subjective dream interpretation. For him also, dreams could also be prospective. So he wanted to orient the conscious mind And he thought that it's about what the unconscious wanted to do and where it desired to go. Um, so that was kind of cool. Um, yeah, that's enough on him. Let's quickly talk about Adler for a bit. Adler was known for the individual psychology, or he'd call it indivisible psychology. Adler believed that personality is a unitary construct, and he was not a big proponent of the split conscious-subconscious divide, and rather he conceptualized them as being part of the same mind, right? So for him, dreams were an expression of the conscious mind, and they served a protective function, um, where it would allow the dreamer to find resolutions to problems, and that was stimulated from within the dreams. So in some sense, the dreams were also forward-looking, and they were problem-solving. Unfortunately, we don't really have any method of analysis left behind by Adler because he was not really good at providing written notes. Okay, so a little bit of dream interpretation from Ty. So this, what Freud would do is he would clarify what is the manifest dream. He'd probe for day residues, right? What happened a day or two before this nightmare, any recent work episodes, so on and so forth. And then he would begin free association. He would invite Ty to associate freely about these elements within the house or within the dream individually, separately. So he'd talk about the house, the storm, the jars, the bunny, the man in black, and so on. And then he'd go again and again and again and let him just associate freely. And he would listen for resistance within this, where Ty would hesitate or laugh things off or maybe just change topics. This apparently was often a gateway to repressed material. So, and this is how he would reconstruct the latent content. Now, within Thai, what I can say is that some examples of condensation would be that the house could be condensed to have multiple meanings. It could be his mind, it could represent his work environment, his inner defenses, and he's running into a shelter, just as he may flee into work or flee into isolation to escape emotional storms. The man in the black condensed could mean like a hidden self, or his own destructive tendencies, his harsh superego, or maybe even an external exploitive force like an employer, right? He's both the victimizer and the victim in some sense. And the bunny could be his innocence, right? His childlike self, his vulnerability, his relational needs. In terms of displacement, his sense of meaninglessness, isolation, and passive suicide wish could be displaced into the spectacle of the bunny being tortured to death, right? It's an unbearable idea, right? I'm being emotionally tortured. I'm destroyed. I want to get out. It could be the bunny is being destroyed, right? Or in another sense, it could be aggression that might be directed at the self and could be displaced onto the man in black in the bunny scenario. And finally, representation. The storm, the darkness, the dust, the barrenness, the horridity of the dream. It could just visually embody his depressed mood, right? Or the emptiness that he feels in his life, or maybe even just some sort of emotional sterility, a lack of something that he's not getting, some sort of insecurity. It could also be, what else could it be? Lab machine, yeah, or like the lab and the machine. It could be a representation of this like mechanized environment that he's going through, or maybe you can see that it's some sort of dehumanizing experience, right? So it's all quite interesting. And then at the very end, themes, right? So what could be the themes here? Themes could be, you could feel like his work and his lifestyle are draining him. They're sucking the life out of him. It's like the machine extracting the bunny's insides. He's unconsciously perceives himself as the bunny, innocent, trapped, being sacrificed. Maybe there's some sort of strong self-directed aggression towards himself. Part of him, the man in black, wants to punish or annihilate the vulnerable. And maybe he needs to get out of the way so that productivity and success can go on, right? There can also be passive suicidal ideation there, Maybe if I was dead, I wouldn't have to deal with this. And it could be this desire for an escape through death or just a desire for escape, right? And that's facilitated through this vision of death or through collapse. So it could be a bunch of things. And this was, I guess, in some sense, what would be called conflicted wish fulfillment, right? On one side is the wish for the end of the struggle, right? This representation of annihilation. And on the other hand, it could be, this refusal, the tension of being so scared. I don't want to die, right? This generates anxiety. And in this sense, it fails to fully protect the sleep of the, the dreamer, and the dream work process fails. Okay, I think that's just about it. I do love this painting. It's by Francisco Goya. Um, and I just want to touch on this because it's so cool. I think artists visually capture dream work quite well in some way. And yeah, this is part of Goya's black paintings. Later on in his career, he went through a period of isolation and he kind of went crazy. He was sick, he was going deaf, and he painted 15 or so paintings as murals on the walls of his house when he was isolated. Nobody really knew this was going on, and when he died, people showed up to his house and found these haunting murals, and this is one of them. This is a Saturn devouring his own son. Some people say that it could be a political commentary or an allegory, right, for the times that were going on in Spain, I believe, at the time. Saturn was also, as a mythical creature, was the god of time, right? So he is devouring time. So it could be, representing his limited time devouring him. It could be also just a reflection of his insanity and his fear. He was going crazy. He was isolated. He didn't know what was going on. I mean, look at those eyes. The eyes are just mad. Um, and lastly, what I thought was interesting too is that some people say that it could have been a reflection of parental anxiety. He had several children, many children, I think 5 or 6, and apparently only one of them lived into childhood. So I think this is a dream image in some sense, and it captures or could capture a lot of different things. It's difficult to say what the latent content is, but the manifest content is haunting and beautiful. Okay, that's the end of my slide.